I want to start the study by saying that I respect others who hold to the Genesis gap as being before the creation of light, but I don't agree with them. If there is a Genesis gap, then it happened after the creation of man. I can't believe in Satan falling before the sixth day, because then God said everything was created good. That would make Satan older than the rest of creation, which in my mind actually elevates Satan. They are taking scriptures from prophetic books like Ezekiel and Isaiah and trying to make the scriptures they're getting from Ezekiel and Isaiah historical doctrine. And I don't think that starting point makes sense. And for me to go through this whole topic it's going to take forever. There's a good study done by Jessie Delewski, called it the gap theory, and then he has like hours of work on it, and it just goes through King James Bible scriptures and he simply explains what the Bible says about the topic, and I agree with most of the things he says. Now we're looking at Genesis 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Okay, Hugh Ross from reasonstobelieve.org has interpreted this as God creating the three basic scientific components of the earth. That means time, space, and matter. In the beginning, time created the heaven, space, and matter, the earth. I'm cautious of going in that direction because he also adds things like created 7 space dimensions, time, space dimensions, and trying to remind people of string theory, and tries to make the Bible conform to his secular view of science, which is sometimes a good idea and sometimes it might distort it. Many times we just need to read what the Bible, the words say, and just believe it in that way and remember it in that way, because then you can have cross-references and then cross-reference it with other places where it talks about the heaven and the earth. Throughout Scripture, Jews had the utmost confidence in this historical recording and frequently referred to it. They also understood this as something that defines the main truth about God. Okay, and then there's Jeremiah chapter 32 and verse 17. In Jeremiah chapter 32 and verse 17 it says, "Ah, Lord God, behold, thou hast made the heaven and the earth by thy great power and stretched out arm. And there is nothing too hard for thee." Then Jonah, being a Hebrew and wanting to explain to the Gentiles who his God is, the God of the Hebrews, he said the following, "And he said unto them, I am an Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, which hath made the sea and the dry land." So that's Genesis 1 verse 1. I take it as it is written. I don't add anything to it. I believe that's what happened. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now verse 2. "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." Many scholars go deep into the Hebrew when they're trying to interpret this verse. Some have written books just on the word. The earth was, the word was, without form or void. They want to say it means, and the earth became without form and void. And that's another way to justify the Genesis gap. Fortunately, I don't think those who hold to the Genesis gap in the Bible-believing movement want to change that word. They are fine with it remaining as was. Let's look at the words without form. Now, obviously, if darkness was upon the face of the deep, that would mean that the water had a shape in space. And it wouldn't make sense to use the words upon the face of the deep if they weren't on earth. So the waters, I believe, was on earth, and they had a shape in space. So that means I believe that the earth had a shape, but it wasn't formed yet. It's like the lazy man said, "I'm getting into shape." And round is a shape like any other. Verses in the Bible that refer to the roundness of earth, like Isaiah says that God sits upon the circle of the earth, and then the earth also has 4 quarters in the Bible and 4 corners in the Bible. And that only makes sense to me if the earth is a globe shape. But I'm not going to go into the shape of the earth this morning. That'd be a study for another time. So verse 2 says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." The verse says, the earth was without form and void. I believe there was no Satan on earth in that time frame. I believe there was no dead remains of angels destroyed in a flood, because that's where they think the waters covering earth comes from. They believe it was a flood that was used to address the Satan becoming evil and the angels following him. And in some way they lived on earth, which doesn't really make sense to me, because angels are supposed to be spiritual creatures. When they manifest in real life, they manifest as men. And we see them eating with Lot and his people in Genesis, meaning that they were physical men, like Jesus proved that he was a physical man, eating also in the New Testament. Like we see in the flood of Noah, that the flood was, you can look up the verses, there are verses that specifically say the flood of Noah was for the purpose of making an end to life on earth, and all those that have the breath of life in their nostrils, which the angels, if they were spiritual, would not have had. It says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." I don't believe we're ever going to be recovering fossil fuels from the angels that died in that time frame. I think the only fossil fuels we have today is the fossil fuels that we got from the flood in Noah's time. Because the vegetation before the flood was great upon the earth. I believe the natural circumstances in the world before the flood was better than it is today, and that plants and creatures of all sorts were able to thrive in various manners. "And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, Let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness." It's only proper that God divided the light from the darkness if we consider later verses in the Bible about light and darkness. In 1 John chapter 1 and verse 5 it says, "This then is the message which we have heard of him, and declare unto you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all." 2 Peter 1 verse 19, "We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well that ye take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn, and the day star arise in your hearts." 1 Peter 2 verse 9. 1 Peter 2 verse 9. "But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, an holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 5. 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 5. "Ye are the children of light, and the children of the day. We are not the children of the night, nor of darkness." 2 Corinthians 6 verse 14 says, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness?" And 2 Corinthians 4 verse 6 says, "For God, who hath commanded the light to shine out of darkness, hath shined in our hearts, to give the light of the knowledge of the glory in the face of Jesus Christ." The New Testament refers back to events in Genesis chapter 1, and here we see 1 Corinthians 4 verse 6 referred to the creation of light, God making light shine out of darkness. It's fascinating that God starts Genesis 1 with the world being in darkness, considering that the tabernacle also had a part that needed to remain dark. And Solomon also said that God was residing in darkness, him and the ark. And Then there's other verses where God, when He is wrathful, then He has darkness around His feet. God residing in darkness doesn't mean God is darkness Himself, but that also doesn't mean that darkness is a bad thing in every single situation. This darkness in Genesis 1 is not a darkness of evil, but a darkness of a clean canvas. God has not created light yet. That's why darkness was upon the face of the deep. Verse 4 says, "And God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness." I would like to return to the concept of the earth being without form and void. Genesis 2 and verse 7 says, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." So the ground was there. The problem was that the ground wasn't formed into a man yet. And I think it's the same with the earth in general. There was just no form given to it. So the earth was there, but no form was given to it. Isaiah 45 verse 7 that says, "I form the light and create darkness," showing that God can use the word form to say that He's making it. So forming, if God had not formed it yet, that means He has not done something creative to it yet. So Isaiah 45 verse 7 says, "I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things." Here, God creating evil does not mean that God in Himself is evil. That verse has a whole explanation on its own, and it might have various explanations also. And I would say the most sensible explanation for this verse where God says He creates evil would be that the type of evil over there is not wrongness, things completely contrary to God. I think it's an evil of difficult situation that He causes when people are sinful. To address the sin, He is able to address their sin. He has the authority to do so. When it comes upon them, they feel, this is a great evil that has come upon us. I don't think it would be wrong for them to phrase it in that way if they keep in mind that God in Himself is not evil. So that's how I understand that verse. Isaiah 53 verse 2 says, "For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him." So here we also see something without a form. Jesus was without a form in Isaiah 53 and verse 2. "And as a root out of dry ground, he hath no form, no comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him." Right, then there's Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 2 and 3. Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 2 and 3. "Then I beheld, and lo, a likeness, as the appearance of fire, from the appearance of his loins, even downward, fire, and from his loins even upward, as the appearance of brightness, as the color of amber. And he put forth the form of an hand, and took me by a lock of mine head. And the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven, and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem." Here Ezekiel also sees something that has been given the form of an hand. Then there's Daniel 2 and verse 31. "Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image." This is Daniel 2 and verse 31. "This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible." So here you see that form can be something that's terrible. The form of the earth could have been terrible, but we see it did not have any form. So in the sense that it wasn't a terrible form, that's a good thing. So the earth being without form is not saying that the earth was bad in that time frame. It's not finished yet. God didn't do anything with it yet. And so Philippians 2 verse 7 says, "But made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men." The earth previously did not have the form, and afterwards it received the form. In the same way, Jesus previously did not have the form of a servant, took upon him the form of a servant, becoming a man for us and dying for us on the cross. That's how I look at the word form in Genesis 1 verse 2. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. Verse 5. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. Here God divides the darkness from the night, and then there is evening and morning. This might mean that the earth was the only shadow, and that would make sense if we consider that the earth was without form and void. So there was no hill that could have a shadow, and there was no creature upon the earth that could also have a shadow. He divided the light and the darkness. He called the darkness night, and the light he called day. Just an idea. Verse 6. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." So the firmament can be one of three things. The firmament can be the space between the water on earth and the clouds in heaven. Then it can also be, according to theory, before the flood, the earth had a stronger magnetic field, and ice reacts to magnetism. There probably was a layer of ice around the earth. That would explain why we find denser air in bubbles caught in amber these days. That came from long ago in history past. So the air in the bubbles is denser, which can be explained by a layer of ice around the earth. And then that would also explain why the people before the flood didn't die so soon, not being affected by so many X-rays coming through the ice, because the ice would keep the X-rays from coming through. Today we get older quite sooner because we walk in the X-rays that come from the sun every day. Now all these things not written inside the Genesis, and so we don't need to know all these things. We just simply need to read the book and believe it as it is written, and have peace with what is given to us. But some people find studying the possible sciences that explain these things interesting, and because we're covering Genesis 1, I found it fitting just to share those things this morning. But they are theories, and I'm not going to put my head on a block about them. The third possibility about the firmament, it being the ether, that's a whole other realm of theories. The ether is a substance that moves in space. I've seen that it affects some of how light moves upon Earth, and that would explain why the Bible makes a suggestion that the stars and the sun and moon are also in the firmament, which would be something difficult to explain by those who believe that the firmament is only the part underneath the clouds, or only the part underneath the ice that's held up by the magnetic fields. We'll look at that verse later when we get to the stars, reading about that. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. So here we see God forming the earth. Verse 10. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So here God names the things he are creating from the beginning. And I think he names them because it's like him ordaining them as official, and says, okay, this is the heaven, this is the earth, this is the seas, this is the land, and I'm going to use it in some way. I believe Genesis 1 is a chapter of origins. Verse 11. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, and herb yielding seed, and the fruit yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." And it was so. And we can find seeds in fruit today. It's not like what God is saying over here is something that's unfamiliar, not something that we find in real life. And the evening and the morning were the third day. And God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven, to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years. So God created the stars in heaven with a purpose. Verse 15, And let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven, to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. The other way of looking at this is looking at the reality that God is talking about the lights and not about the light source itself. So maybe the light within the firmament is not the light source. In that way, the light source might be outside the firmament. But after some study, I've been moving a little bit away from that. So I think the lights are actually inside the firmament. That looks to me like a literal interpretation of that passage. Verse 17, And God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. And God said, Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. So here God calls something the open firmament of heaven. I can't see if it's clear whether this is the same firmament and the same heaven, and if there's more than one firmament. What's clear is that the birds fly in the open firmament of heaven. I'm assuming it's the same firmament as the firmament in which the stars are, but it might also be a firmament on its own, so that you can have the heaven and various firmaments within it, and one of them is called the open firmament of heaven. But I'm not going to go into detail about that because I can't see detail, and I'm pleased with it. I don't need to know everything. I read the Bible and I accept the way it's written, and I believe the things it says, even though I don't understand it sometimes. Verse 21, And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth. The modern versions take away great whales and they replace it with sea creatures, or they will replace it with sea monsters. I think it really affects your view of God if you are to believe that God created monsters. I don't think that's not the way it's supposed to be phrased. There are places in the Bible where God refers to sea monsters. But what's interesting is that that's after the flood. And we see in Genesis chapter 8 or 9 that God tells Noah that from now on the animals are going to be afraid of you. And it's from that time on forward that animals were a danger to people. Then I believe that makes sense. How animals are monsters to people, because they can attack you and kill you. But I don't think you can say the same of the animals before the flood. And that's why I believe the word monster is not found before Genesis and chapter 8. And then, of course, you have your land whales, like the Brachiosaurus, Apatosaurus, Hadrosaurus, Stegosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops. But of course, the translators were wise enough to call them dragons, like any normal person would. Quite large creatures, but you can't call them whales, because they're not in the sea. And of course, when writing history, you try to use words which other historians and students of history will recognize. I think it's the Egyptians that called Moses' transformed staff a land whale. So Moses used that word in Exodus chapter 7 so that the Egyptians could look it up in their history, which of course is no longer needed today. It was a serpent, that's all it was. Context determines the meaning. If it's in the sea and it hasn't killed anybody yet, then it's a whale. Verse 21, And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly, after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. And the evening and the morning were the 5th day. The fowls and the fishes, they are free to move in any direction they want to, and they were created on the same day. And the contrast between the fishes being underneath the water and the fowls being above the water in the air. Verse 24, And God said, Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and the beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and every thing that moveth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. The other reason why they wouldn't want to have whales in the beginning of creation is, according to evolution theory, fish became land-living creatures. And then some land-living creatures became ocean-living creatures again. And they believe the mammals came from the land and that they didn't originate in the sea. So you can't have whales in the beginning because they're mammals. And so the whales in the beginning, they're supposed to be on the land. And so the only things in the water would then be great sea creatures and not whales. So that's the other reason why a person would want to change that, affecting people's faith in the Bible, trying to look through the glasses of modern science. And there's nothing wrong with modern science in the places where there is truth being spoken. I love science. We can speak about science all the time without lying and without fabricating things. And verse 24, And God said, Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and the beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and every thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Verse 26 I consider as pivotal. There's so many ways we gain doctrine from the scripture that should not be changed. Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air. God made Adam in his image and after his likeness. And something I've recently discovered, if you turn to Genesis chapter 5 and verse 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam, in the day when they were created. And Adam lived 130 years, and begat a son in his own likeness, and after his image, and called his name Seth. So what I understand from that is, after Adam sinned, he received a new image. Maybe not completely new, his image was affected by sin. So Adam's sons, which would also include their sons, were born in Adam's image. And that image has 3 features as far as I can understand. That image cannot live forever. At some point in time we die. And secondly, that image has shame, because before Adam and Eve sinned, they didn't have shame. Now we are able to have shame. A very small child doesn't have shame immediately, but as he grows, he will learn shame. He will understand, okay, it's not sensible to go around without any clothes. It's not sensible to say what I want to, kill what I want to, look at what I want. A little child doesn't understand it, but eventually a person will realize, okay, but the child understands there is something like shame. So that's the second thing about the image that changed. And then the third thing, which is something difficult for me to understand, in some way, sin has had an effect. And the reason why this is difficult for me to understand is, it is something I believe, that the blood of Adam and Eve has been affected, and that Cain and Abel has now received the blood of Adam and Eve, and that bloodline includes all of mankind. I'm just cautious because I won't say that if any one of us lived in the time frame of innocence, if it was any one of us except for Adam and Eve, I would be cautious to say that any one of us would not have taken of the fruit. And I would also not say that we don't have as much freedom as Adam and Eve had, in the sense of as much as they were able to do good instead of evil, in that same way we are able to do good instead of evil. And in the same way they were also able to do evil instead of good, we're also able to do evil instead of good. I believe in complete freedom of the will. I don't think our will is affected in any way. The image of Adam is just different with those three things that we just mentioned. Verse 26, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it. That word replenish is a wonderful word. It's a blessing that he wants them to replenish the earth. For more information on the word replenish, watch the replenish video on my YouTube channel. So, looking at verse 27, and God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female, and created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every herb yielding seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life. I have given every green herb for meat. And it was so. I've once met a Rastafarian, and he was very upset with the fact that verse 29 said, to you it shall be for meat, because he was a vegetarian. He said that the Bible is translated wrong. It's not supposed to be, it shall be for meat. Obviously, meat in that time frame didn't mean flesh of animals in every single instance. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat. And it was so. You'll see animals eating plants when they are sick. You'll see a dog eating grass when it's sick. There's also carnivore animals that were vegetarian. There was a vegetarian lion that they used for actors, so that the actors wouldn't be afraid of the lion. The lion wouldn't even drink milk if you added one drop of blood to the milk. That's how vegetarian the lion was. The lioness lived back in the 1950s at Hidden Valley Ranch in California. Her name was Little Tyke. At 4 years old, she weighed 159 kilograms. She was a strong and large creature. She could run 64 kilometers per hour. Her vegetarian lifestyle didn't affect her at all. After the flood of Noah, the fear of man, the necessity of food, and the permission of God brought many creatures to hunting for meat, that is, flesh. But like we see in Genesis chapter 1, that is not how God made them to begin with. It is a time frame or commandment difference. Some call it a dispensational order from God. Either is good English, as long as you don't misinterpret me. Fortunately, the Lord will restore this again. Peace with currently carnivore creatures, so that they will not hunt for other animals or attack people in the future. This is in the millennial reign of Christ, and especially during eternity. You can read it according to Isaiah and chapter 11 verse 6. And you can also go to Isaiah and chapter 65 verse 15. This is why it's so horrible when the modern versions add the phrase wild animals to Genesis chapter 1. It is a corruption in the doctrine. They didn't attack people, they lived in peace. You can't say they are wild animals. If it's not the same, one rendering is in error. Verse 29, And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. And that's something I agree with, because you can turn to Proverbs chapter 8, verse 22. Proverbs 8 and verse 22. The Lord possessed me in the beginning, this is wisdom talking, beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was. When there was no depths, I was brought forth. When there was no fountains abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills was I brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he set a compass upon the face of the depth. When he established the clouds above. When he strengthened the fountains of the deep. When he gave to the sea his decree, that the water should not pass his commandment. When he appointed the foundations of the earth. Then was I by him, as one brought up with him, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him. Wisdom was rejoicing. Verse 31. Rejoicing in the habitable part of his earth, and my delights were with the sons of men. Wisdom was rejoicing when God created the world. Wisdom wasn't upset that Lucifer fell and had to be destroyed in a flood along with all the other angelic creatures. Not a good interpretation of Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14. Ezekiel 28 also addresses Satan's destruction in the future and not only things about his past. In Jesus' name, amen.